Hello there, and welcome to JJ Painting. I am JJ, and today we're going to talk about a very interesting army in Age of Sigmar. Yes, we're doing an Age of Sigmar video. I've been doing so much 40k recently, I feel like we just needed a little bit of a change, so here we are. And today we're going to be talking all about the Cities of Sigmar, an interesting army, which I think needs a little bit of further discussion, especially seeing as how new it is, and now that we've had a chance to get to grips with what it actually is, I think it's worth talking about. So for today's video, we are going to be painting this Dark Elf Sorceress right here, if anyone remembers that model, a bit of a blast from the past. So that's going to be the painting topic today. So, without further ado, let's crack on! So let's start off, as I am wont to do on this channel, by having a short history lesson. The Cities of Sigmar book is comprised of the old races, in most part, from the old Warhammer Fantasy range. So amongst them, we have the Empire of the humans, we have the dwarves, and we also have the elves, and all three of the elven races as well, so high elves, wood elves, and dark elves. Now immediately, if we look at the rest of the Grand Order Alliance especially, we can see the other parts of many of those races present. So for example, if you look at the dark elves, you can see them present in the Daughters of Cain. The Idoneth Deepkin are somewhat a bit like high elves, but not really. The Lumineth Realm Lords certainly are high elves in many respects. And then the Sylvaneth are a branch off of what used to be the Wood Elves, and the Caradron Overlords and the Fire Slayers. Interestingly, amongst all the many factions we're seeing amongst the Grand Alliance of Order in Age of Sigmar, we haven't seen any new factions that are dedicated to humans just yet. I know there is an argument that that's what the Stormcast Eternals are, but again, the Stormcast Eternals are actually the spirits of fallen warriors from multiple races, so they don't necessarily count, to be honest with you. But this is not that story. This is the story about the Cities of Sigmar. So it is a foregone conclusion at this point to say that the Cities of Sigmar very much are many of the remaining kits, some of which were quite new for Games Workshop, only being about 7 or 8 years old at the time of the Cities of Sigmar book coming out, to be put together and to form their own faction, obviously under the Cities of Sigmar. Now, I'm not stating anything new, but this is just so that we're all firmly on the same page. And in many respects, I honestly think it was a good idea, but I think we need to talk about the longevity of this good idea. So let's start off with what's actually quite good about them. So I will say one thing now. I think it's very nice that there at last is actually a coalition army outside the Chaos factions. In some respects, the Grand Alliance of Chaos has the broadest accessibility out of all four of the Grand Alliances, simply because so much more of the armies are organised around the Chaos Gods, rather than being organised around the individual races, which is why you can have Nurgle, Tzeentch and Khorne armies and Slaanesh armies with far more accessibility to units without losing their special rules or their battle traits than you do in, for example, the Stormcast Eternals, or you do in the Legions of Dingash, or the Ossiarch Bone Reapers, for example. And in many respects, it does harken somewhat back to the slightly now romanticised era of Warhammer Fantasy battles, where there would be massive alliances that would be cross races that would go off and fight the forces of chaos coming out of the Northern Wastes. Those were very nice ideas, and to be honest, we never really got to see them in action unless you were playing multiplayer games. So this is a very good thing, I think, to kind of rekindle and hold on to that spirit, even if it is just for a bit longer. The other thing I'd say is that because it is so much more diverse in terms of what you're playing with, obviously that means your models and your army look far more interesting on the table, rather than if you're playing Stormcast Eternals, for example, where everyone's in heavy suits of power armor, or magic, yeah, let's just call it power armor, because it's power armor. Everyone's in magical power armor, and everyone looks very much the same. Even for Chaos, arguably, yes, you do have demons, and you have raised units for the gods, and you have your mortal units, but ultimately the aesthetic is still largely surrounding one thing. Whereas in this one, you can have dwarves, you can have elven crossbowmen, you can have human gunners with cannons, you can have hydras, and of course you can have flying machines. And I think that's all really interesting, and it's all really cool, and that is all part of the same army book. Now, what this does allow us as players as well, if we're not particularly interested in a large chunk of it, it means that we can really customise this army to a frankly ridiculous degree, and I'm very glad that that's available now to Age of Sigmar players. Because as I've said in other videos, the limitations that Games Workshop placed on its players for many years have started to be eroded, and I think this is a good one to start getting rid of the limitations on what players can play with, because it means that they're a bit more invested in trying different things and trying new things all within the same army book. And I think the last of the biggest advantages, to be honest with you, is that it means that no one's getting left behind. I remember when the plastic executioners and plastic greatswords came out about 9 to 10 years ago, maybe 8 years ago, so all before Age of Sigmar was even a thing. It's nice to see that those kits have stayed and haven't simply all been removed, purely to make way for the newer parts of the Order, to make way for the new Order or the new Grand Order models. And it's interestingly as well that this is one of those things where Stormcast Eternals don't feel like they're taking up more space than they need to. Unlike Space Marines, who absolutely dominate 40k, the Stormcast Eternals haven't taken such a massive chunk out of Age of Sigmar just yet, and I think that is a good thing. However, there are obviously some disadvantages to this approach as well. So, for example, one of the big and most obvious ones was there were no unique units that came with the Cities of Sigmar. Now, whilst I appreciate, in some respects, people who were playing things like Empire or Dark Elves or Dwarves back in the day suddenly had access, realistically, to more units that they before wouldn't have been able to have unless they were playing those armies already. So in some respects, by opening the door for more players to have more models, technically that was a release in a way, but not really at the same time, if that makes sense. What I'm trying to say here is that if you weren't playing Dwarves or Dark Elves, but you were playing Empire, suddenly you had have access to all those models, and vice versa. So whilst no new models came out, everyone who was playing those older armies suddenly had access to entire ranges that they had no access to before. But obviously, that then comes with the caveat, like I said, no specific Cities of Sigmar models have been released. So there is no model in that range currently that you look at and go, that is representative of the Cities of Sigmar. But again, when we think about the lore, that still makes sense. But in a player who wants and sometimes even expects a release, there isn't that. I'm not saying I think it's a bad thing, but I definitely think it's one of those things which is a consideration to a lot of people. The second thing, which is a bit more pressing, is that it does feel like the Cities of Sigmar were a bit of an afterthought in some respects. If we look at the timeline, the Cities of Sigmar book came out in 2020. Age of Sigmar first dropped in 2015. And almost all of those kits were therefore pre-2015. Now, if we then think about how that actually looks on the paper, that means that there were 5 years with most of those kits only being able to access the Grand Order Alliance datasheets and only having access to the very limited number of battle traits and command abilities and command traits that were present in that very now out-of-date book. So if we then take that and then move that thinking of there's not a lot of content for these units and no unifying force, and that would have been 5 years effectively in the wilderness for people whose armies would have consisted of those models largely. And as things started to come out, such as, especially in the cases of the Daughters of Cain, for example, who took a chunk of the old Dark Elf range and became their own standalone army, it suddenly meant that what was left was suddenly struggling to find a place in the game for itself and arguably struggling to hold on to any sort of identity. Now, whilst I'm sitting here and talking about all this, I think it's also worth remembering that because they do now have a book, they do now have special rules. And again, that's something which they do now have. They do now have the individual cities that give them all distinct battle traits and army abilities, which is good. But again, that took a very long time to happen. And I think the last thing to bear in mind, and this brings me on to my next point as well, is that because it took so long for that book to happen, it does raise the question, why did it take so long? Was it just that there was no plan for it originally? Was the original idea to simply start removing those armies and those lines from circulation? Or was this always the plan, just to wait until Age of Sigmar got a bit more of a following and had a bit more traction? It's hard to know for certain, and this is speculation, but I do think it's something to bear in mind. And that then leads me on to my next point as to what is going to be the future of the Cities of Sigmar army book. Now, like I said, I personally quite like it. I like some of those kits that are in there, and I like the fact that they are so customizable, and I like the fact that together you can get some very distinct armies on the table. But my question is very simple. What's the future for this army going to look like? Now, that could manifest in a whole bunch of ways. That could manifest with, like I said, and what like a lot of people think is going to happen, is eventually those armies are going to start to disappear from circulation and their rules are going to stop getting updated. On the other hand, it could be that this is actually the springboard for a whole new faction that's going to be more of a glue that brings the Grand Alliance order together. As you know already, or you should know, if you are playing the Cities of Sigmar, then you can actually have Stormcast Eternals. I think it's a quarter of all your units can be Stormcast without having to use up your Alliance points allowance, which is quite a good thing. So thankfully Harkuron was brought in during the Morathai book that recently came out at time of recording, and we're starting to see a city which is exclusive to the Druchii, for example. Now that's a difference that we may not have thought we were going to see before, but obviously it's an old school way of playing which may appeal to some of the older players, so it's nice to see them balancing a new approach to things along with harkening back to the old times. By drawing on that idea that some of the cities do remain more separate, it both works from the lore, because that does make sense, but it also works from a gameplay perspective, because people who want to keep with their armies being purely one race or purely another, and it does reflect quite nicely that we are going to see the races maybe move apart in the future, but we'll always have a common basis that does bring them back together. And it would be interesting to see that expanded with the other cities as well as time goes by, if you'll be able to use things like Sylvaneth, Cadron's, Daughters of Cain, all as core parts of those armies rather than simply being allies and limited to being allies. So for me, to conclude on, I think that the Cities of Sigmar book as it is now has given the army some very interesting rules, especially because the cities are so distinctive. I think the rules themselves are pretty good. Now, this isn't an army book review at all, but what I will say is that the way they play, especially if you can get the synergy with the city and the right models, which is reflected in some of them work better with the old dwarven units, some of them work better with the old dark elf units, but also I think it's a very good thing to have for them to have for now. I honestly think that it's going to have to change as time goes by, and we will see what it actually means to have a Cities of Sigmar army. It is entirely possible that the Cities of Sigmar book is going to disappear in a few years. Maybe not immediately, but possibly in due course. Or it could be that we start to see it growing and expanding, like I said. But time will tell. But as it is now, it's okay. But ultimately, I don't think it can stay as it is now. And like every other thing in Age of Sigmar, it will have to move on. But the reason this one's particularly interesting is because it draws so much from the old Warhammer Fantasy legacy. In many cases, it is the last clearest link, in terms of the models at least, to that legacy. Especially as things like chaos and destruction and even death all take much smaller chunks of that old legacy, and even though their models are still present, they're not as prominent as the older ranges are. Whereas with the Cities of Sigmar, those older models from those older ranges are front and center. And it's going to be interesting to see what happens to them, if they survive or if they start to disappear. But as always, I want to hear your thoughts on it. Do you think the Cities of Sigmar was a good idea to begin with? Do you think it's going to survive? Do you think it's going to disappear? And if it does survive, how would you like to see it change if it's going to become a core part of Age of Sigmar like the Stormcast Eternals? And ultimately, do we think that it could itself stand up to be one of the biggest and most unique armies? Or will it only ever be a callback to an era gone by? Let me know your thoughts. I'm interested to hear from you. So there we have it. That's my thoughts on the Cities of Sigmar and where they are and where they might end up being in the next few years. As always, I want to hear your thoughts on this. If you find it interesting, let me know, and let's continue the discussion in the comments section. Let me know your thoughts below. You know, like, subscribe, all that good YouTube shilly stuff. I try to post videos on Wednesdays and Fridays, as I hope you all know by now. So thank you all very much for watching. Here is our lovely sorceress, and she'll be coming up over my face in a minute as well. So as always, goodbye and have a lovely day.